my name is Danielle Castro, and this is my prose presentation. I chose the fable of the tale of Peter Rabbit just because sometimes I feel like everyone is given signs or warnings not to do something, but we still continue to choose to ignore them even though we're most likely going to get a negative outcome. And in this story, it shows a little bunny who does exactly that, and he gets the worst of it. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits. Their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dear," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put into a pie by Mrs. McGregor. But now run along and don't get into mischief. I am going out." Then old Miss Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of bread and 5 currant buns, while Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was a very naughty bunny, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed right under the gate. First he ate some lettuces and some French beans, but then after feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley, but around the end of the corner, who should he meet but Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, and he jumped up and ran after Peter, raising a rake, saying, "Stop, thief!" But Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten his way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes amongst the cabbages and another one amongst the potatoes. But after losing them, he ran on 4 legs so he could go faster. He might have gone away altogether, but if not, unfortunately run to a gooseberry net and was caught by the large buttons on his jacket. Peter gave himself up for loss and shed big tears. But his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. But Mr. McGregor came up with the sieve which intended to pop on top of Peter. But Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can where it had been a beautiful thing to hide in, except there was water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter had hidden somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps underneath the flower pot, so he began to pull him over quietly. But presently Peter sneezed, "Achoo!" But Mr. McGregor was after him in no time after that. And he tried to put his foot upon Peter, who was jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 tree plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor to squeeze through, though, and he was tired of running after Peter, so he went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright. He had not the least idea which way to go, and he was also damp with sitting in that can. After he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, lippity-lippity, not very fast, but looking all around. He found a door in the wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a little fat rabbit to squeeze underneath, and an old mouse who was running in and out of the stone doorstep carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her which way was to the gate. But she had a large pea in her mouth, and she couldn't answer. She only shook her head at him, and Peter began to cry. He then tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently he came to a good pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was sitting there with some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. But Peter thought it would be best to go the other way without speaking to her. He went back towards the tool shed, and suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the sound of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch. Peter scuffled underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon the wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and behind him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly and off the wheelbarrow. He started running as fast as he could along the straight walk behind the black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate, and he was safe at last in the woods outside the garden. Mr. McGregor then hung up his little jacket and shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. But Peter never stopped running and looked behind him until he got home to the very big fir tree. He was so tired, he flopped down upon the nice soft floor of his little rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking, and she wondered what had he done with his clothes. It was the second jacket he'd lost in a fortnight. But I'm sorry to say that Peter was not very well during this evening. His mother put him to bed and made him some cameline tea, and she gave him a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoon to be taken at each bedtime. But luckily, Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread, milk, and blackberries for supper.